My daughter banned me from her wedding, then called to ask for my credit card for the honeymoon. Linda Foster, mother of the bride, and single parent for 28 years, didn't raise her voice. Sophie, the little girl whose school trips I once saved for, laughed like my answer was already yes. By morning, the express envelope with my card would be on its way, tucked beside a legal notice she never saw coming. I'd been both provider and parent. Now I was the guardian of my own boundaries. And when she opened it in her hotel suite, Sophie finally learned what declined really meant. I'm curious, where in the world are you joining us from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed for all the latest updates. Her words were like a slap, but her smile never faltered. The February evening wrapped Eleanor in a thin, damp chill as she stepped onto the porch of her son's home. She carried a bottle of Cabernet in one hand, the label hidden in a paper bag, her other hand curled tight around the strap of her purse. It was meant to be a small gesture, something to smooth any sharp edges that might be lingering between her and Sarah. Sarah opened the door looking flawless, hair in a sleek twist, a fitted navy dress with not a speck of flour or sauce in sight. "You're early," she said, tone clipped but polite. "I thought I could help," Eleanor replied, holding out the wine. Sarah took it, her manicured nails brushing the paper bag. "The kitchen's handled," she said. "David's in the den." Eleanor hesitated in the hallway, drawn toward the sound of pots clinking. Sarah moved like she was choreographing each step, flipping potatoes, opening the oven for just a second, before closing it again without glancing in Eleanor's direction. The coldness in her manner was subtle, but it seeped under Eleanor's skin. Dinner was laid out with magazine-perfect precision: roasted chicken, buttered green beans, potatoes fragrant with rosemary. Candles flickered between them, their light glinting off polished silverware. Eleanor tried to ignore the knot in her stomach and joined the conversation, asking about Sarah's work, about David's latest project, careful not to press too far. Halfway through the meal, Sarah set down her fork with a measured motion, the faint scrape cutting through the low hum of conversation. "You're not invited to the wedding," she said, voice airy as though the words were harmless. "We've decided it's best." The sentence hit Eleanor like cold water poured over her head. Her hands froze above her plate. "I see," she said softly, though her mind was a swirl of disbelief. "It's nothing personal," Sarah added, offering a tight smile. "We just want to keep the day uncomplicated." David looked at his plate, the muscles in his jaw flexing, but he said nothing. Eleanor laid her fork down carefully, the silver clinking against porcelain. "Well, I hope it's everything you want it to be." The rest of the meal blurred, conversation reduced to polite fragments. Eleanor excused herself before dessert, slipping on her coat with deliberate calm. Outside, the night air was bracing, slicing through her like glass. She walked to her car under a lone street lamp, the light casting a long shadow that followed her to the door. The drive home was silent, except for the rhythmic thud of the tires on the asphalt. She replayed Sarah's tone, the careful smile, David's silence. It wasn't just exclusion, it was something colder, something meant to put her in her place. At home, she hung up her coat and poured a glass of water. The house felt heavier than usual, its quiet pressing against her ears. She stood at the kitchen sink, watching the slow drip of the faucet, until her phone buzzed on the counter. The name lit up the screen. Sarah. The message was short. "If you want to contribute, we'll need your credit card for the honeymoon." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. The heaviness in her chest shifted into something sharper. "Eleanor receives a message from Sarah. If you want to contribute, we'll need your credit card for the honeymoon." She had the audacity to ask me for money after she banned me from her wedding. Eleanor stood in the kitchen with the phone still in her hand, the text glowing on the screen as if mocking her. She read it once, twice, a third time. Each pass made the words feel sharper, slicing past disbelief into something colder. Her first instinct was to delete it, to let the silence answer for her. But instead, she set the phone on the counter and pressed her palms against the edge until the wood dug into her skin. She could still see Sarah across that dinner table, smiling with the same mouth that had just asked for her money. The kettle on the stove hissed faintly as it warmed, but Eleanor didn't move. She was stuck on the phrase, "If you want to contribute," as though being erased from the wedding wasn't enough. She now had the privilege of funding a trip she wouldn't even be told about. The phone buzzed again. Not Sarah this time. Lorraine, wine night still on Friday. Eleanor called instead of texting back. Lorraine answered on the second ring. "You sound tight as a drum. What's happened?" Eleanor told her, voice measured but threaded with steel. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. "She's testing you," Lorraine said without hesitation. "Seeing how far she can push before you snap. Don't let her get away with it." Eleanor let the words hang there. "What do you think I should do?" "I think you should remind her who she's dealing with," Lorraine replied. "And not with an argument she can twist into making you the villain." That night, Eleanor didn't sleep much. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing the faint creak of the house settling. The thought of doing nothing gnawed at her. It wasn't about the money. It was about what giving it would mean. Compliance, acceptance. By morning her course was clear. She dressed without rushing. Wool slacks, a sweater in a shade of blue she'd always liked on herself. She brushed her hair until it shone, the same way she did before important days, because this was one. At the bank the air smelled faintly of paper and toner. The teller recognized her, offering the usual pleasantries, but Eleanor's voice was low and direct. "I'd like to arrange something special, a withdrawal and a card to match it." The teller blinked, then nodded, sliding a form toward her. "Any particular limits or conditions?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "This card will be a gift, but it needs to make a statement." They spoke in the sort of quiet, coded language that left the teller smiling knowingly by the end. When Eleanor walked out with a small envelope in her bag, the cold morning air felt almost invigorating. At home she placed the envelope on the kitchen table and sat in front of it for a long time. She could have simply mailed it as it was, letting the gesture speak for itself, but something in her resisted. She took out a single sheet of her best stationery, the heavy kind she kept in a drawer for thank you notes, and uncapped a pen. Her handwriting was slow, deliberate. She didn't rant, didn't scold, she didn't even mention the dinner or the wedding. One sentence was all it would take. When she finished, she read it twice, folded it neatly and slid it into the envelope alongside the card. She pressed the seal shut with the heel of her hand. Later, as she stood at the post office counter, the clerk asked, "Anything fragile, liquid, or perishable?" "None of the above," Eleanor said, her tone polite, almost warm. "Just something personal." She watched the package disappear behind the counter, the tracking number tucked into her purse. Outside, the afternoon light was thin and pale, but her shoulders felt lighter than they had in weeks. She didn't know when Sarah would open it, didn't care, really. She only knew that when she did, everything between them would change. Eleanor adds a special note to the card, just one sentence that will change everything. It wasn't just money I was giving her, a choice she'd regret. The envelope sat on the dining table like a coiled snake, sealed, ready yet unmoved. Eleanor passed it every time she crossed the room, her eyes catching on its pale surface, the weight of it pulling at her like an unspoken dare. She had the card now, the balance set just as she'd arranged. It would have been easy, effortless, to drop it in the nearest mailbox and let it run its course. But easy wasn't the point. Not anymore. In the quiet of her kitchen she opened her laptop and began searching resorts, flights, travel packages. Her fingers moved with purpose, scrolling past glossy images of white sand beaches and candlelit dinners. She wasn't looking for something romantic. She was looking for something calculated. By the afternoon she had a plan. A travel company in Key West offered honeymoon packages, complete with all the bells and whistles, champagne on arrival, embroidered robes, a curated welcome basket, the kind of place Sarah would brag about on social media. Eleanor booked it under Sarah's name, attaching the card details, knowing the hotel staff would welcome her with all the warmth her own words never had. But there was something missing, something personal. She called Lorraine. "Tell me I'm not overthinking this," Eleanor said. "You've done enough," Lorraine replied gently. "Send it and move on. Don't waste more of yourself on her." "I can't," Eleanor said. I've earned the right to be heard, and she's going to hear me, whether she realizes it or not. Lorraine sighed but didn't argue. Just don't let it eat you alive. After they hung up, Eleanor went to the linen cabinet and pulled out a small cedar box. Inside were odds and ends from years gone by. Ticket stubs, postcards, notes David had written as a boy. She sifted through them until her fingers found what she didn't even know she'd been looking for. A faded Polaroid of a much younger David on a fishing trip with his father. His grin was unguarded, his hands gripping the line that held a small silver fish. Eleanor stared at it for a long time before sliding it into a blank envelope. On the back, in her careful handwriting, she wrote, "Remember who taught him how to hold the line." The phrase could mean a dozen different things or nothing at all, depending on how Sarah chose to see it. But Eleanor knew its weight. It wasn't just a photograph. It was a reminder that the man Sarah married hadn't been shaped by her alone. She wrapped the Polaroid in tissue paper, placed it alongside the credit card, and then slipped both into a deep blue gift box lined with silver paper. She tied it with a white satin ribbon, making sure each bow loop sat perfectly. No detail was accidental. Before sealing the outer package, she added a card. No flowery message, no lecture, just her signature, looping and confident, with the date. By the time she was finished, dusk had fallen. The room was bathed in amber light from the table lamp, shadows stretching long across the floor. Eleanor sat for a moment, looking at what she'd made. It was beautiful. It was deliberate. And it was hers. The next morning, she carried the box to the post office herself. The clerk weighed it, slapped on the shipping label, and pushed it toward the back. Eleanor kept her expression calm, but her chest tightened as it left her sight. On the drive home, she rolled down the window, letting the cool air whip through the car. She had acted. She had spoken without raising her voice, without giving Sarah the satisfaction of an open confrontation. Back in her kitchen, she stood by the window with a cup of tea, watching the late afternoon clouds gather over the neighborhood. Somewhere in that package was more than a card and a trip. It was a choice. And Sarah, whether she knew it or not, was about to make it. The package is mailed, but Eleanor's mind races with uncertainty about how Sarah will react. When the package arrived, I knew it would be a turning point for her. The box landed on the corner of Sarah's desk with a muted thud, the receptionist's cheerful special delivery fading into the background hum of the office. Sarah eyed it between keystrokes, her curiosity sharpening when she saw Eleanor's looping handwriting on the return label. For a beat she considered leaving it sealed until she got home, but the weight of it, both physical and otherwise, kept her from looking away. She slid her letter opener beneath the tape, slicing it cleanly. Inside, layers of silver tissue crinkled beneath her fingers. She peeled them back to reveal a deep blue gift box, perfectly tied with a white satin ribbon. The neatness of the bow irritated her more than she expected. She untied it in one pull. The lid came off, revealing a gleaming credit card nestled in the center. Beneath it, an envelope lay waiting. Sarah opened it with a flick, expecting a saccharine note about enjoying the trip. Instead, in Eleanor's elegant, deliberate script, she read, "The honeymoon is on me, but this is where you learn what family really means." Her brow furrowed. There was another slip of paper tucked behind the first thicker stock, official looking. Sarah unfolded it, scanning the lines until one phrase stopped her cold. "Legal revocation of beneficiary rights, effective immediately." Her pulse. She read the section again, the words imprinting themselves like a brand. Eleanor had gone to a lawyer. Eleanor had stripped her from the will. The paper trembled in her grip. It wasn't about the money, she told herself. It was about the audacity, the calculated cruelty. Eleanor hadn't just sent her a card, she'd sent her a declaration of war. Sarah's fingers tightened around her phone. She typed without thinking. "Your mother just ruined everything." The message flew to David before she could reconsider. Across town, Eleanor sat in her sunlit living room with a book open in her lap, not really reading. The phone rang. She didn't have to check the screen to know who it was. "Mom," David's voice came in hot, clipped. What did you do? Eleanor leaned back against the cushion. I gave her the honeymoon she wanted, she said, her tone even. You know that's not what I'm talking about, he snapped. You revoked her inheritance. Are you serious? This isn't about money, David, she said. It's about respect, and she crossed a line. You put it in writing that she wasn't invited to the wedding as part of your reason, he said, the disbelief turning to anger. I did, Eleanor replied, because I won't pretend it didn't happen. Actions have consequences. For a moment there was only the faint sound of him breathing on the other end. She pictured him running a hand over his jaw, the same way he had as a boy when he was working up to saying something he knew might sting. You've gone too far this time, he said finally, his voice flat. Eleanor didn't flinch. She closed her book, set it on the coffee table, and let the silence stretch just long enough to make him wonder if she'd hung up. I think, she said quietly, you'll find I've gone just far enough. The line went dead, but Eleanor stayed still, the afternoon light casting long bars across the floor. Somewhere she imagined Sarah at her desk, the letter still in her hand, the words sinking in deeper with every reread. And Eleanor knew this was only the beginning. Eleanor reveals that Sarah's exclusion from the wedding was noted as a reason for the inheritance revocation in a legal document. David angrily says, You've gone too far this time. They wanted me to apologize, but I was done being their scapegoat. The phone rang again before Eleanor had even finished her morning coffee. The caller ID flashed David, and for a moment she considered letting it go to voicemail. But she'd never been one to dodge a storm. Mom, he began without greeting, his voice You need to call Sarah and fix this, right now. Eleanor set her cup down carefully. Fix what, exactly? You've turned our entire engagement into a sideshow, he said. Sarah's humiliated. My friends are asking questions. Her parents are furious. This, Eleanor cut in, is the direct result of her actions, not mine. You can't keep using that as an excuse, David said. You could have let it go. Instead, you made it about you. A sharp laugh escaped her before she could stop it. About me, David, I've sat through every slight, every cutting comment, and I've kept my mouth shut for your sake. But being told I'm not welcome at my own son's wedding, that was the line. She drew it. I just decided not to step over it quietly. That's not what families do, he argued. No, Eleanor said, her voice steady. Families don't exclude each other from their milestones without reason. Families don't take and take without giving respect in return. I'm not controlling you, I'm standing up for myself. Silence hung on the line. She imagined him pacing somewhere, torn between loyalty and frustration. You should think about what you're doing, he finally muttered. You're going to regret this. I doubt it, Eleanor said, and ended the call herself. She was still standing in the kitchen when the next ring came. Sarah this time. Eleanor debated answering but pressed the button anyway. What the hell is wrong with you? Sarah's voice was sharp, almost brittle. Do you have any idea how vindictive you look? You think this little stunt makes you powerful? Sarah, Eleanor said evenly. You made it very clear where I stand in your life. I simply responded in kind. You're going to undo it, Sarah said. I'll give you a week to contact your lawyer and reverse the inheritance chain. If you don't. If I don't, Eleanor interrupted, you'll do what you need to do. Call your lawyer, file a complaint, drag me to court. But remember this, she lowered her voice. You've already lost my trust, and that's worth more than anything written in a will. The silence on Sarah's end was icy. When the call dropped, Eleanor didn't bother to check if Sarah had hung up first. She spent the afternoon in her garden, pruning back the roses, letting the repetitive snip of the shears work through the adrenaline that still lingered from both calls. The sky was overcast, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower droned. By the time she came inside, dusk had begun to settle. She was washing her hands at the sink, when the landline rang, an unusual occurrence these days. She dried her hands and answered. This is Eleanor Grant, she said. A male voice responded crisply. Mrs. Grant, my name is Thomas Keller. I represent Sarah Mitchell. I'm calling to inform you that we'll be initiating legal proceedings to challenge the recent amendment to your estate documents. Eleanor's lips curved into something between a smile and a smirk. Then I suppose I should thank you for the courtesy call. There was a pause as though the lawyer was recalibrating his approach. I suggest you seek representation immediately. Oh, I will, Eleanor said. I'll be ready. She hung up, the click of the receiver sounding like the closing of a door she had no intention of reopening. Sarah's lawyer calls Eleanor. She's prepared for a legal battle. The letter arrived like a thunderclap, but I had already prepared for the storm. 3 days after Thomas Keller's call, a heavy cream envelope appeared in Eleanor's mailbox, its weight betraying the contents before she even slid it open. The law firm's logo was embossed in deep blue at the top, polished, expensive, designed to impress. She took her time opening it, not out of dread, but to savor the fact that she wasn't the one on the defensive here. The pages inside were printed on thick stock, the legal language neatly arranged into paragraphs that alternated between feigned courtesy and thinly veiled threat. Demand for immediate reinstatement of beneficiary status. Failure to comply within 7 business days will result in litigation. Eleanor read it twice, her expression unchanged. If they thought this tone would rattle her, they'd miscalculated. After making herself a fresh cup of coffee, she walked to her office, a narrow room lined with bookshelves and a single window that caught the afternoon light. She retrieved a leather-bound notebook from the desk drawer, flipped past pages of neat cursive notes, and found the section marked Ruth. She'd worked with Ruth Stanton before, years ago when settling her late husband's estate. Ruth was the kind of lawyer who didn't waste breath or ink. If she told you something was a battle worth fighting, it was. Eleanor called her, the warmth in Ruth's voice almost making her forget the gravity of the situation. Got your letter? Ruth asked. I did, Eleanor said, and I imagine it looks much the same as every other letter they send to people they expect to scare. That's because it is, Ruth replied dryly. From what you've told me, Sarah doesn't have a case. A will is a personal declaration of intent. Unless they can prove coercion or mental incapacity, the court won't overturn it. Eleanor smiled faintly. So you're saying I should stand firm? I'm saying you should make them work for every minute they try to waste of yours, Ruth said. If they're serious, let them file. We'll respond. In the meantime, I'll draft a formal reply, polite, clear, and immovable. By the end of the day, Ruth had sent her a copy of the response. Eleanor read it with satisfaction. Mrs. Grant's decision regarding the distribution of her estate is final and reflects her considered judgment. She will not be making any amendments at this time. Eleanor signed it, her pen steady, and returned it for Ruth to send. That evening her phone rang again. David's voice was strained, but not as heated as before. Mom, can we just talk about this? We are talking, she said, keeping her tone measured. I mean, really talk. This has gotten out of hand. You could just reverse it and we could all move on. She closed her eyes for a moment, picturing his face as a boy when he'd come to her, cheeks flushed, asking her to fix a scraped knee or a broken toy. That same plea was in his voice now, but this wasn't a wound she could mend for him. This isn't about reconciliation, Eleanor said softly. It's about setting boundaries. And once you do that, David, you can't step back without losing yourself. He didn't respond right away. She could hear him exhale, the sound of someone who knew the conversation was already over. I'll see you in court then, he said finally, the bitterness creeping back in. Perhaps you will, she replied. 2 days later Ruth called. They've filed, she said. Preliminary hearing in 3 weeks. I'll send you the details. Eleanor thanked her, hung up and stood at the window for a long time, watching the bare branches sway in the late winter wind. She didn't feel fear, not more like the hum of anticipation before a storm finally breaks. The sense that once it starts, there will be no pausing it, no turning back. The court date is set. Eleanor steels herself for the upcoming battle. The courtroom was cold, but my resolve was even colder. The marble floor amplified every step as Eleanor entered the courthouse, her low heels clicking a measured rhythm. Ruth walked beside her, a slim briefcase in hand, her presence radiating quiet authority. The air smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, a blend of history and judgment. Inside, the courtroom was larger than Eleanor had expected, its high ceiling and narrow windows casting pale winter light over rows of benches. She kept her chin level, refusing to glance toward the gallery where the hum of whispered voices swelled as she took her seat at the defense table. The doors at the back opened again. Sarah strode in with Thomas Keller trailing half a step behind. Her posture was all performance, shoulders square, chin tilted, but there was a tightness around her mouth that Eleanor recognized. Smug, yes, but not unshaken. When the judge entered, the murmurs died instantly. His robe swayed as he settled behind the bench, scanning the docket before announcing the case. Eleanor felt the weight of the room's attention shift, pressing in on her like a tangible thing. Thomas was the first to speak, his voice smooth and deliberate. He painted Sarah as a devoted daughter-in-law wronged by a sudden, spiteful disinheritance. Every phrase was calculated, arbitrary, retaliatory, without justification. Eleanor sat still, hands folded, absorbing each word without reaction. She let him frame the stage, knowing her turn would come. When Ruth rose, her tone was cool enough to frost glass. "Your Honor," she began, "this case is not about it is about the fundamental right of an individual to decide how their estate is distributed. Mrs. Grant's decision was neither sudden nor without cause." She slid a folder across the table to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. Inside were the notarized amendments, timelines, and a succinct statement outlining the events that had led here. "Mrs. Grant," Ruth said, turning toward her, "would you please explain in your own words why you chose to amend your will?" Eleanor rose slowly. The wood floor under her shoes was slick, but her footing felt solid. She looked at the judge, not at Sarah. "I was told by my son's fiancé that I was not welcome at their wedding," she said, her voice steady but low enough that the room leaned in. There had been a history of disregard and disrespect before that moment, but being excluded from my own child's marriage was the clearest statement of all. I chose to respond in a way that reflected my values. My will is a reflection of my relationships and my boundaries. She sat, feeling the silence settle before Ruth took over again. From the corner of her eye, Eleanor saw Sarah's jaw tighten as Ruth listed specific incidents, never embellished, always documented. The late-night text demanding funds, the casual dismissal at family gatherings, the pattern of taking without gratitude. The judge listened, fingers steepled, gaze moving between the lawyers and the evidence. "Your Honor," Ruth concluded, "Mrs. Grant has acted within her rights, and her reasoning is clear. The decision was formalized through proper legal channels. There is no basis for reversal." The opposing counsel stood again, trying to puncture holes, suggesting emotional instability, impulsive action. Ruth countered each point with quiet precision. Through it all, Eleanor kept her eyes forward. She could feel David behind her, somewhere in the gallery. She didn't need to turn around to know he hadn't looked at her once. That knowledge ached more than she wanted to admit. When the arguments concluded, the judge leaned back in his chair. "I'll need a short recess before I make my ruling," he said, his voice even. "We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. The judge calls for a recess ruling to be announced soon. The verdict wasn't what I expected, but it wasn't defeat either." Eleanor stepped into the courthouse hallway, the buzz of conversation from the gallery bleeding into the marble corridor. The air here felt less cold than the courtroom, but sharper somehow, like every word spoken could be carried back in. Ruth excused herself to take a call, leaving Eleanor with the echo of her own footsteps. She didn't notice the man approaching until he was just a few paces away. "Eleanor," he said quietly, removing his cap. It took her a moment to place him. "Cal Parker?" she asked, her brow lifting. She hadn't seen him in years, not since David's high school graduation, when he and his wife had sat 3 rows behind her in the bleachers. Cal nodded. "Didn't think I'd see you in a place like this. But I figured you should know, I've been watching all this and I can help." She studied his face, looking for the angle. "Help how?" "I've known Sarah a long time. Saw how she talked to you at the fundraiser last year, like you were something stuck to her shoe. And before that at the Mitchells' Christmas party, when she told people you weren't really part of the inner circle. I was standing right there. His mouth tightened. If the court needs to hear it, I'll say it. It was unexpected. Both the offer and the sincerity in his tone. That could make a difference, Eleanor admitted. Cal gave a small shrug, as if brushing away his own importance. Figured you deserve someone in your corner who's not paid to be there. Before she could respond, Ruth returned, eyes flicking between them. Eleanor introduced them quickly, explaining Cal's offer. Ruth's expression sharpened in the way it always did when opportunity presented itself. That testimony could reinforce the pattern of behavior we've established, Ruth said. The judge is already weighing credibility. This tips it. When Cal stepped away to make arrangements with the bailiff, Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She could imagine how Sarah would take it. Another voice speaking to her character, and not in her favor, and in a twisted way that knowledge carried a weight of its own. Sarah would see this not just as legal pressure, but as a betrayal by someone she'd likely considered neutral. Back inside, the courtroom hummed with the subtle tension of an approaching endgame. Sarah's lawyer rose first, launching into a flurry of closing remarks that clung to the same points he'd made earlier. Eleanor's decision was punitive, excessive, and rooted in emotion rather than reason. His tone bordered on theatrical, the sort of cadence meant to sway anyone still undecided. Then Ruth stood, her voice quieter, but cutting through the air with the precision of a scalpel. The plaintiff would have you believe this case is about feelings. It is not. It is about an individual's right to define her own legacy. She glanced toward Cal in the gallery. And the behavior in question is not speculative. It is documented, witnessed, and now corroborated by third parties with no vested interest in this outcome. Sarah shifted in her seat, her fingers curling against the table. Eleanor didn't look at her, but she felt the heat of her glare. When Ruth concluded, the judge turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Grant, is there anything you wish to add before I deliberate? Eleanor rose slowly. Yes, Your Honor, just this. I did not come here to win or lose in a legal sense. I came here because sometimes, the only way to protect yourself is to draw a line and keep it, even when it's uncomfortable. I have no malice toward Sarah, but I will not apologize for valuing respect as much as love. Her words hung in the room, simple but impossible to ignore. The judge's gaze lingered on her for a long moment before he leaned back. Given the additional testimony and arguments, I will need more time to consider my ruling. The judge announces, I will render my decision in full. When the verdict came, it wasn't just legal, it was personal. 2 mornings later, Eleanor dressed as if she were going to church, navy suit, silver brooch at her lapel, hair neatly pulled back. She didn't need the armor, but the ritual steadied her. The courthouse steps felt different today. The air was damp, the sky the pale gray of paper before ink touches it. Inside, the same high-ceilinged courtroom waited, but now the gallery was fuller. News of the case had spread. A few curious faces turned toward her as she took her place beside Ruth. Sarah and Thomas Keller arrived moments later, both taut with unspoken tension. The judge entered without preamble. No small talk, no drawn-out introductions. He began reading from his notes, his voice level but carrying the weight of finality. In the matter of Mitchell versus Grant, I have reviewed the evidence, testimony, and applicable law. Eleanor's hands remained folded in her lap, but she felt the faint vibration of her pulse in her fingertips. The plaintiff has not met the burden of proof to overturn the amendment to Mrs. Grant's estate plan. The court finds the amendment valid and enforceable. Furthermore, due to the nature of the challenge and the absence of compelling evidence, court costs will be borne by the plaintiff. A murmur rippled through the room. Sarah's shoulders stiffened, her chin dipping slightly, not in humility, but in the brittle way someone braces against humiliation. The judge continued, his tone unchanging, but each word seemed to land like a gavel strike. The estate remains as amended. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell, and for a moment Eleanor simply sat there absorbing it. Relief washed through her in quiet, controlled waves, not triumph, not gloating. Just a deep exhale she hadn't realized she'd been holding for months. As the crowd began to disperse, David approached the aisle where she stood, His voice was low, guarded. You got what you wanted. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. No, David, I got what I needed. He shook his head, as if trying to dislodge the moment, then walked away before she could read his expression. Sarah didn't speak to her at all, but Eleanor could feel the animosity like a heat in the room, the kind that lingers long after the fire's out. Outside, Ruth allowed herself a small smile. Not all cases end cleanly, but this one did. Eleanor nodded. It's over, except it wasn't. Not entirely. That evening she called Lorraine, who answered on the first ring. So, how did it go? It's done, Eleanor said. The court upheld everything. I knew they would. You've earned a break from all this. Lorraine's voice brightened. You should take that trip we've been talking about. Somewhere warm. Somewhere far away from people who think they can write your story for you. Eleanor hesitated, then smiled faintly. Maybe I will. The next day, as she sifted through the mail, she found a thick, cream-colored envelope. Not the cold formality of legal correspondence, but the kind of weighty stationery reserved for something more intimate. It was from the executor of a long-ago friend's estate. Margaret, a woman Eleanor had known in her 20s. They'd lost touch decades back, but the letter explained that Margaret had left her a modest but meaningful inheritance. For the woman who once showed me how to start over, the note read in Margaret's handwriting, tucked inside. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, letter in hand, a warm tide of surprise and gratitude rolling through her. The timing felt almost too precise, as if the universe had decided to underline the lesson she'd been living these past months. What you keep is often far less important than what you let go. She opened her laptop and began browsing flights, her cursor hovering over destinations like Charleston, Santa Fe, Savannah. Every click felt like a step toward something unburdened. By late afternoon, she had a short list and a flicker of excitement she hadn't felt in years. She began folding clothes into a suitcase just to see how it felt. The knock at the door came just as she zipped it shut. Not a hurried knock, measured, deliberate. When she opened it, Mark stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes shadowed by something between regret and resolve. Eleanor, he said quietly, we need to talk. Eleanor plans to leave for a new chapter, but Mark shows up at her door. He came to make amends, but I wasn't sure I wanted them anymore. Eleanor held the door halfway open, letting the chill of the evening settle between them. Mark stood there, a little older than she remembered. His shoulders sloped, hair thinner at the temples, the lines around his mouth etched deeper. He was still holding himself like a man who wanted to speak, but hadn't yet found the courage. I didn't think you'd answer, he said. I almost didn't, she replied. He shifted, glancing past her into the house, as if he could read the mood in the arrangement of furniture. Can I come in? Just for a few minutes? After a pause that stretched long enough to register, she stepped back. He entered cautiously, his eyes moving over the space, lingering on the suitcase still open on the couch. Going somewhere? He asked. That was the idea. Mark nodded, as though the sight confirmed what he already suspected. He stood in the middle of the room, hands in his coat pockets, rocking slightly on his heels before finally speaking. I owe you an apology. Eleanor crossed her arms, leaning against the edge of the dining table. She didn't offer him a seat. For what exactly? For not saying anything. For letting it all happen without standing up for you. His voice was low, but each word carried the heaviness of something rehearsed and dreaded. I saw what Sarah was doing. I saw David's silence, and I told myself it wasn't my place to get in the middle of, but it was. I should have been there for you. The words hit somewhere between her ribs and her throat. She'd imagined hearing them in some form for months, but they didn't land like she thought they would. They didn't undo the loneliness or soften the sting of having faced it all alone. I appreciate you saying that, she said finally. But an apology doesn't erase the time you chose silence over loyalty. Mark looked at her then, really looked, his eyes tired, but unflinching. I know, I'm not here to pretend it does. I'd like a chance to make things right. If you'd let me. She studied him, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of his own admission. And what does right look like to you? It looks like being in your life again, he said. Not as an obligation, as someone you can count on, as family. The word lingered in the air, but it didn't hold the meaning it once had for her. Family had proven itself to be a fragile title too easily revoked, too easily used as leverage. I'm not sure I can offer that, Eleanor said quietly. Not yet. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, like he'd braced for that answer. Then I'll wait. However long it takes. She let the silence breathe for a moment, her gaze drifting to the half-packed suitcase. The truth was, she didn't feel anger toward him, not anymore, just a kind of cool distance, like a road she'd traveled before and had no desire to revisit. Mark, she said, her tone softer now, I think you should go. I need some space to think, to figure out what I want next. He hesitated, then moved toward the door. I'm sorry, Eleanor, he said again, his voice rougher this time, for all of it. When the door clicked shut behind him, she exhaled slowly. The room seemed quieter than before, the ticking of the clock unusually loud. She turned back to the couch, zipped the suitcase fully, and set it upright by the door. Tomorrow could still be about moving forward. On her way to the kitchen, she noticed an envelope on the floor near the mail slot, thin, no return address. The paper was an off-white, the flap sealed with a strip of plain tape. She turned it over in her hands, the weight of it almost nothing, but something in her gut told her the contents might not be light at all. Eleanor receives a mysterious letter with no return address. The letter was from Sarah, but the contents were unexpected. Eleanor stood by the kitchen counter, the envelope balanced in her hand like something alive. She slid a knife beneath the taped flap, careful not to tear what lay inside. The single sheet was folded with precise edges, the handwriting unfamiliar in its neatness. The first line made her stop. Eleanor, I owe you more than this letter, but I don't know where else to start. It was signed at the bottom, Sarah, she read on. The words were stripped of the defensive polish she'd come to expect. Sarah admitted, plainly, that she had handled things poorly, that she had been protective of her place in David's life to the point of cruelty. That excluding Eleanor from the wedding had been less about peace and more about control. She described the moment she received the inheritance notice, how her first reaction was anger, but her second, after the quiet settled, was shame. She wrote about David's silence, about the conversations they'd avoided, and about realizing too late that her choices had scorched more than just a relationship. They'd burned bridges she wasn't sure could be rebuilt. By the end of the page, Eleanor's hands were still, her breath slow. She set the letter on the counter and poured herself a glass of water, staring out at the bare branches swaying against a slate sky. She wasn't sure what to feel. Relief wasn't quite right. Neither was vindication. What she felt was space. A gap where the knot in her chest had been, as if someone had loosened it without asking permission. The phone rang, startling her. Lorraine's voice filled the line. You sound like you've seen a ghost. Not a ghost, Eleanor said, glancing at the letter. A surprise. Lorraine listened as she read a few lines aloud, her voice even without embellishment. That's something, Lorraine said when she finished. Not nothing, but don't mistake words for change, don't rush forgiveness, but allow healing. On your terms. I'm not rushing anything, Eleanor said. She hung up and moved to her desk. Pulling out her stationery, the heavy cream paper she saved for things that mattered, she sat down with her pen poised over the blank sheet. The first lines came slowly. She thanked Sarah for the honesty, acknowledged the difficulty of putting such words down, but she didn't apologize for her own actions, and she didn't offer easy reconciliation. Instead, she wrote about boundaries, about respect, and about the possibility of something better if they could both leave the old patterns behind. She left out the word forgiveness. It wasn't off the table, but it wasn't something she'd hand over like a wrapped gift. When she finished, she read the letter twice, then slid it into an envelope. She sealed it, pressing the flap closed with the heel of her hand, and wrote Sarah's address in her careful script. The house was quiet as she carried it to the hallway table, setting it beside her key. Tomorrow she'd walk it to the post office herself. She lingered there for a moment, fingers resting on the envelope. Whatever came next, whether Sarah replied or stayed silent, it wouldn't change the fact that Eleanor had chosen her own pace, her own. Eleanor closes the envelope. I'm ready to move forward. This time my life was mine to shape. Eleanor stood at the kitchen counter, the letter to Sarah now gone from sight, replaced by a small stack of travel brochures and her laptop screen, glowing with flight options. The cursor blinked beside her chosen destination, Savannah, its quiet charm and weathered elegance calling to her in a way nothing had in years. Lorraine sat across from her, a cup of chamomile steaming in her hands. "You've got the hotel, the walking tours, even the dinner reservations," she said, scanning the itinerary Eleanor had printed. "You're not just dipping your toe in, you're diving." Eleanor smiled, feeling the truth of it in her chest. "If I'm doing this, I'm doing it my way." The planning felt different than the rigid organizing she'd done in the months of the legal fight. This was light, flexible. She could change her mind without it feeling like failure. The sense of control was still there, but without the tension that had once gripped. Over the next week she cleared her calendar of obligations that didn't serve her. She called her financial advisor and arranged her accounts in a way that gave her more liquidity for travel and projects. The inheritance from Margaret had been modest, but she treated it like a seed, reinvesting most of it into a portfolio she'd been too cautious to explore before. Mark texted once, a short message asking if she'd left town yet. She didn't reply. Sarah, for her part, remained silent. Eleanor knew they were still circling in the shadow of her choices, but their absence from her days was a kind of quiet she was beginning to cherish. The house felt lighter too. She donated clothes she hadn't worn in years, cleared out the guest room, and turned the space into a small art studio. One Saturday morning, she found herself standing in the local community center, signing up for a watercolor class. By the second session, she was laughing at the way her hands refused to make clean lines, meeting the eyes of strangers who became acquaintances, then friends. There was a man who ran the pottery workshop across the hall who brought her coffee on breaks, and a retired teacher who shared her love of old jazz records. None of them knew her as David's mother or Sarah's antagonist. They knew her as Eleanor, the woman who painted the marshlands in shades of blue and gold. In the evenings, she'd sit by the window with the radio low, painting until the sky faded to indigo. The world felt wider, her days no longer measured by what she'd lost, but by what she was choosing to keep. One night, Lorraine came over with a bottle of wine and they sat at the kitchen table surrounded by brushes and half-finished canvas. "You look different," Lorraine said, pouring them each a glass. "Lighter. Like you finally put something down that you didn't realize you were carrying." Eleanor swirled her wine, thinking about the letter to Sarah, about the months of strain and the court battles. The day before her flight, she stood in her bedroom, suitcase open, folding linen blouses and comfortable shoes into neat stacks. She slipped Margaret's note into the inside pocket, less as a talisman, more as a reminder that new beginnings didn't have to be tied to ending. That night, she set her alarm for an early start, but she hardly slept. It wasn't nerves, it was anticipation, the kind she hadn't felt since she was young enough to believe the future was still mostly unwritten. The next morning, the airport buzzed with the familiar chaos of rolling suitcases, coffee lines, and announcements echoing overhead. Eleanor moved through it with an ease she hadn't expected, her ticket tucked securely into her bag. As she walked down the jet bridge, she felt the subtle vibration of the engines through her shoes. The smell of warm air and jet fuel filled her lungs. She stepped onto the plane, found her seat and fastened her belt. Outside, the sky was streaked with pale pink and gold. Eleanor boards her flight, heading into the unknown. Not every question needs an answer, but some answers are too late. The hum of the plane's engines faded into the clink of glasses and soft shuffle of feet in the aisle. Eleanor pressed her forehead lightly to the cool window, watching Savannah's patchwork of rooftops shrink until they became little more than sunlit geometry. By the time she stepped out of the taxi onto a narrow cobblestone street, the city wrapped itself around her like a living postcard. Spanish moss swayed from branches older than anything she'd ever owned. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and salt. Her days quickly settled into a rhythm, morning walks past pastel houses with wrought iron balconies, afternoons in bookshops where the air was thick with the scent of paper and ink, evenings lingering over shrimp and grits at tucked-away restaurants where no one knew her name. But in the quiet moments on a shaded bench in Forsyth Park, in her hotel room with the window open to the sound of cicadas, questions still pressed at the edges. She thought of Mark, of his apology left dangling in the space between them. she thought of Sarah's letter, raw and unexpected. What was she supposed to do with those pieces? On her third night, a message buzzed through while she was sipping a glass of wine on a rooftop terrace. "Mark, can we talk? Just once. I won't ask again." Eleanor stared at the screen. A year ago, the words would have pulled her in, made her believe there was an obligation to respond. Now she felt the same way she did when passing a shop window full of shoes she'd once longed for, appreciation without desire. She set the phone down without replying. Lorraine called the next morning, her voice warm, laced with a smile. Eleanor could hear. "So tell me everything. What's it like?" Eleanor leaned against the balcony railing, looking out over the sleepy street. "It's like breathing after holding my breath for too long." "That's exactly what you need. Keep it that way. No backtracking, no reopening wounds, just because someone knocks." "I'm past that," Eleanor said, and realized she meant it. Her trip stretched beyond Savannah. She took a train to Charleston, then caught a flight to Santa Fe, letting the landscapes change the texture of her days. In the high desert, she walked art markets in the thin morning air. In Charleston, she sat in a pew of a sunlit church, letting the organ's swell fill the empty spaces in her. Mark texted twice more, short, careful phrases, but she left them unread. Sarah's silence held longer, and Eleanor began to understand that it wasn't her role to maintain or repair the fragile threads they'd left between them. Some ties weren't worth mending. They were worth releasing entirely. She began each day with the same small ritual: coffee, a stretch at the window, and the quiet conviction that she no longer owed herself to anyone else's storms. The absence of drama wasn't empty, it was spacious. In Santa Fe, she wandered into a gallery that specialized in landscapes painted by local women. One canvas stopped her cold sunset over a marsh, the light turning the water to molten gold. She bought it without thinking, arranging for it to be shipped home. It wasn't just beautiful, it was a reminder of who she'd been learning to be. On her last evening, she sat in a courtyard strung with lanterns, her journal open but untouched. The pages no longer needed to catch her frustrations. They were slowly filling with lists of places she wanted to see, things she wanted to try, names of people she'd met who made her laugh. The decision came easily. She would not return to the shadows of Mark or Sarah. Whatever they thought of her now, they would think without her. Her final flight landed in the soft light of late afternoon. As she wheeled her bag toward the taxi line, her phone buzzed in her pocket. The name on the screen made her pause. "Sarah." She tapped it open. "I want to fix this." Eleanor stood there, the world moving in slow arcs around her. The taxi driver waved her forward, but she didn't move. The message sat on the screen, waiting for an answer she wasn't sure she would ever give. Eleanor gets a final text from Sarah. "I want to fix this." Not every story ends in reconciliation, but every story ends in peace. Eleanor read Sarah's message once, then again, letting the words roll through her mind like pebbles in the surf, softened by repetition, but never quite smooth. "I want to fix this." Months ago she would have felt her pulse quicken, the itch to answer immediately. Now the phone felt almost weightless in her hand. She locked the screen and slid it into her bag without typing a single word. Her peace, she decided, was too costly to risk. The next morning, she took a taxi to the coast. The ocean here wasn't the wild, thrashing expanse of the Atlantic she remembered from her childhood trips. It was quieter, gentler, a pale sheet of silver under a soft blue sky. The sand was cool beneath her bare feet. She walked for hours, stopping only when the wind shifted and brought with it the scent of salt and seaweed. The horizon stretched endlessly, and she thought of all the lines she had crossed in the past year, not ones drawn by others, but the invisible thresholds she had set for herself. Winning in court had been a relief, but as she stood there with the tide foaming around her ankles, she realized the true victory had happened long before the judge's gavel fell. It had happened the moment she stopped asking for permission to protect herself. She found a flat rock and sat watching the slow curl of waves. A gull wheeled overhead, its cry sharp and clear. Somewhere behind her, children laughed, the sound carried thin by the wind. She closed her eyes and let it all drift in. Life continuing, whether she was part of certain stories or not. When she returned to the city that afternoon, she didn't check her phone. Sarah's message could sit in digital amber for eternity if it wanted to. Eleanor's silence was not punishment, it was preservation. The flight home was uneventful. The city she landed in was colder, the air dry with the whisper of winter still clinging to it. As she wheeled her suitcase through her front door, the familiar scent of her home wrapped around her. Not the stale weight it had carried in the months after the legal fight, but a fresh, open feeling, like new paint in an old room. She unpacked slowly, hanging her clothes, setting her new marsh painting in the studio against the wall where she could see it while she worked. The note from Margaret stayed in her travel journal, a reminder that kindness planted decades ago could still bloom when you least expected it. For the first time in years, she gave herself permission to do absolutely nothing that evening. She made tea, curled into the armchair by the window, and let the quiet settle without reaching for a book, a phone, or a distraction. Somewhere in the middle of that quiet, she realized she was done. Done measuring her life against the people who had tried to define it for her. Done leaving space for apologies that arrived too late to matter. She was hers again, entirely. 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived in her mailbox. The return address was a law office she didn't recognize. She carried it inside, slicing it open with the same deliberate care she'd given every legal document in the past year. Inside was a formal letter on heavy paper, and beneath it a smaller envelope sealed in wax. The lawyer's note was brief, an explanation that the enclosed was the last will and testament of someone named Harold Pierce. The name caught her breath. She hadn't heard it in over 30 years. Harold had been her mentor in her first job after college, a brilliant, eccentric man who'd once told her she'd find her wings when she stopped waiting for someone to hand them to her. They'd lost touch after he moved abroad. The will was simple. Harold had left her a collection of rare first-edition books from his personal library, along with a trust to maintain them. Eleanor traced the embossed seal with her finger. She couldn't remember the last time she'd cried over something purely good, but she felt the sting in her eyes now. A gift from someone she hadn't expected to hear from again. One more thread tying her to the truth she'd come to live by. Life was hers to shape, and sometimes the world conspired to remind her of that. She set the letter down, a small smile curling at the edges of her mouth. Her next chapter, she thought, was already waiting. Eleanor smiles. Her next chapter begins. Her voice no longer echoed in my head, only my own laughter. The weeks after Harold's letter felt like an opening door, not the kind that slammed back with urgency, but one that eased forward, letting in fresh air at its own pace. Eleanor found herself lingering over coffee in the mornings, no longer racing to fill her days with obligations she hadn't chosen. She started small, calling Joan, a friend she'd once traveled with, to Napa before life's demands had pulled them in separate directions. They met for lunch in a sunlit cafe, the years between them folding away like creased paper smoothed by warm hands. Joan introduced her to a circle of women who met every Thursday for wine tastings. Soon Eleanor was laughing at their easy banter, realizing how much she'd missed the company of people who saw her without the shadow of family politics. She began to reclaim other parts of herself too. The rare books from Harold's collection arrived in careful, crated shipments, and she spent quiet evenings cataloging them, running her fingertips along the spines like greeting old friends. Some she read again, discovering lines she'd underlined decades earlier, proof of the woman she'd been before she'd learned to shrink her voice for others' comfort. Opportunities found her without her chasing them. A local historical society invited her to give a small talk about Harold's library and his influence on her career. What began as a one-time favor turned into a series of lectures that put her in front of people who valued her knowledge. She realized she enjoyed the work not because it filled time but because it added to a life she already liked living. Travel called to her again. She booked a trip to Maine in autumn to see the leaves burn gold and crimson, and another to New Orleans in the spring. She kept a list of places she'd yet to go, not as an escape plan but as a promise to herself that her world would keep expanding. One crisp morning in March, her phone lit up with a familiar name. She considered letting it ring out, but curiosity and perhaps compassion nudged her to answer. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry again." His voice came rough but steady. Not to reopen anything. Just, I've thought about everything. And I wish I'd been braver. Eleanor let the silence stretch, not in anger, but in the space where she decided how much of herself to give. I forgive you, Mark, she said at last, her tone even. But forgiveness doesn't mean we go back. It just means I'm not carrying it anymore. He breathed out, a sound of release more than relief. That's fair, he said quietly. When the call ended, she felt lighter, not because of what he'd said, but because she'd answered in a way that didn't cost her anything. By early summer she'd sold her house. The decision came one morning, as she stood in the doorway of the guest room, now empty after she'd moved the art supplies to a rented studio. The rooms felt like chapters she'd already read, and she wanted new pages. Her new home was smaller, with a wide front porch, and a garden that bloomed wildly without much tending. She painted the walls in colors she loved without asking anyone's opinion: soft sage in the kitchen, deep blue in the bedroom. Every piece of furniture was chosen for comfort, not for hosting or impressing. On the first evening after she moved in, she sat on the porch with a glass of wine, watching the sun sink behind the rooftops. Somewhere a neighbor's dog barked, and wind chimes tinkled in the shifting breeze. She thought about the year behind her, the courtroom, the silences, the letters, and how they no longer felt like anchors. I don't need anyone's approval, she thought, the words fitting her like a well-worn sweater. I'm enough. The sky deepened to indigo, and a single light blinked on in the house across the street. She smiled into the dark, not because of any particular reason, but because she finally could. Eleanor steps into her new life, filled with peace and possibility.